So the first thing I wanted to look at is just the chart for 9/11 in itself. It brings up a question of when did that event start? And they have a timeline of it on Wikipedia that I was looking at and thinking about this. And whenever you're looking at an event, you really want when the event started. Inception, something being born, something new coming into the world, that's very important in astrology. And so you always want to think about when did an event start. And with 9/11, it's not that clear. I picked the moment when the first plane hit the first tower to do these charts for. But you could say that maybe when the terrorists boarded the planes that it began then. I feel like when the planes hit the tower is more relevant because that's when people knew this was happening. Kind of laying the groundwork for it by hijackers getting on planes is more like the lead up to the actual event. But that's also it's it's a judgment call that you have to make as an astrologer. And you may have a situation where you try to do a chart for something and it just doesn't seem like the chart fits. Sometimes that can be because you're not looking at the real beginning of the event. But to trace back 9/11 as an idea, we don't know when they started planning it, or maybe we do. But the plane hitting the tower, first plane hitting the first tower, is a moment that everybody knew this was happening at that point, or certainly when the other plane hit the second tower. But so this is when that happened. And I just wanted to talk about like what would we look for in a chart like this, that if we were just playing around with astrology and the current stars in the sky on the morning of 9/11, what would we notice that would clue us in potentially that something really bad was going to happen, or something that's really, in Pluto terms, transformative? So the first thing we could look at is conjunctions. There's a lot going on here in the third house of communication, and there's a lot going on here in the ninth house. There's a couple conjunctions there. But one thing that's really very noticeable that I think is probably the crux of the whole thing is Saturn here in the ninth house. So the ninth house, one of the meanings of it is things that are far away or foreign. Say we were doing a love chart for somebody and the ruler of the seventh house was in the ninth house. That would be a way of saying, one of the meanings you could interpret from that is, oh, you're going to marry a foreigner. You're going to marry someone from far away. And at least from the American point of view, and this was New York City that I used as the location for this chart, because of course that's where it happened. Looking at this, you could interpret this as Saturn's the greater malefic, as some kind of negative event coming that is foreign in nature. And you can see that Saturn has an opposition here going to Pluto. So when you've got malefics touching outer planets, this is a time when things are triggered to happen, essentially. And Saturn opposing Pluto is something that happens. If you think about how often this happens, it's not very often. Pluto stays in one sign for about 20 years, 15 or 20 years. And so it's basically standing still. And Saturn takes 30 years to go around the whole chart. So it's pretty rare. It's once in 30 years, maybe, that you have a Saturn-Pluto opposition like this. And so we know also from our study of the aspects that the opposition is Saturn's signature move. It's really, really good at oppositions. And its oppositions really, really suck. They're not enjoyable aspects. And then we know that Pluto has to do with intensifying and transforming. So we have this negative foreign influence opposing what's happening down here? Transformation, because it's Pluto, and we're looking at third house. So when we see third house, we think of things that are close. All of the houses are opposite each other. And I just wrote a Substack about the houses that you can see at, I think it's 418 astrology.substack.com, talking about how all the houses oppose each other. And so they have opposite meanings. And ninth house is far and Pluto is near. So this is something, this is transformation happening on the home front. And something to do with our brains, our mind, our communication. And I think that's a little bit hard to decode, but you can tell from this Saturn-Pluto opposition, which really happens once every 30 years, you that's setting you up for an event. Astrologers working at the time would have seen this, the Saturn-Pluto opposition, and known that it would be linked probably to some kind of outer event, because it is such a rare, it's rare to have Saturn opposing Pluto. When Saturn and Pluto came together, roughly 15 years later, that was the time of COVID. And so the greater malefic Saturn getting involved with outer planets, or either of the malefics, Mars or Saturn, being involved with the outer planets, something's going to happen, essentially, is what astrology tells us. And you can see there's other malefics in the neighborhood. There's Mars and this, which separates, and the south node down here as well, sort of in the same house. And we know this is a strong Mars because it's in Capricorn. So that's something to notice, something to look at. And Chiron here is also, Chiron is a healing force, but in order to be, in the way that Jupiter expands, Venus attracts. Chiron heals. And if you're constantly healing, it means there's a wound that's never healed there too. That's why Chiron's called the wounded healer. So this is just something that was happening in the sky at that time that was bound to trigger some kind of outer event. And it's the kind of thing that as an astrologer you pay a lot of attention to. The other thing is the moon being so close to this Saturn. It had already passed it. It's at 28 degrees of Gemini, and Saturn's at 14 degrees of Gemini. But when the moon is near something, the moon is what manifests in the outer. It's when the moon touches something, that really brings that into focus. Wherever the moon is, the moon really manifests. There was an old way of looking at astrology as our world is like a series of nested spheres, almost like Russian nesting dolls kind of thing. And they'd go all the way out to Saturn, these spheres inside spheres inside spheres. And you can see old illustrations of this. They're kind of great. And so the moon is the one that's closest to us. And so energy from Saturn or from Jupiter or any of these planets would have to come down through all the spheres, and then the moon would manifest it. So having the moon right near this is interesting too. And the north node and the south node being present with these oppositions really kind of strengthens it. Let's see. Is there anything that you guys have questions about before we move on to the next chart that's related to 9/11? And this is just the chart at that plane hitting tower on that day. Another thing I would notice is Jupiter in Cancer, right over here in the ninth house also. So when you see Jupiter in Cancer, Jupiter's exalted in Cancer and is thought really to be even more powerful in Cancer than it is in its own domiciles of Pisces or Sagittarius. And it's right here. So it's any planets that are sharing a house or sharing a sign are they're part of the action. We also know that Jupiter, and especially Jupiter in Cancer, is the ruler of the United States itself, because we've looked at the US birth chart and we've looked at the ruler of that chart, and it's Jupiter, and it's placed in Cancer. And so I don't know at what degree of Cancer. I think I have the US chart next on the next slide. So I don't know if this was exactly on top of the ruler of the United States, but it's definitely in the area. And so this nasty Saturn stuff happening here is affecting this Jupiter. And when you see Jupiter in Cancer, think wealth. And since this is ninth house, we can think wealth from far away. And the money for this event did come from far away. So that's accurate. But seeing Jupiter as a representation of the US, we know that the country itself is being affected here. And you can see when you look at the aspects, this is a square. When you see these red lines that don't cut the pie right down the middle, but go along the side. I wish they were different colors, but they're not. You can see that this Jupiter in Cancer is squaring the ascendant. And so that means that the wealth, and I mean, this was an attack on the wealth of our country, right? The World Trade Center, they were sort of going after the banks, so to speak, and the visible wealth of our country, which would be represented by this. And so this is suggesting the face of the ascent. It's because it's squaring the ascendant, it's suggesting that it's challenging our face and our ruler and our identity as a country. And so, and that's just a snapshot of the sky right at that first moment. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the next one? Okay, so we know that just looking at the chart for that moment is one way that you can look at an event, but another way, as we've been talking about, is looking at the transits. So for the election, we looked at the chart of the US, and this is the same thing on the inner ring here, the chart of the US, and on the outside are the transits for that day, that moment of September 11th. And here's Jupiter at 11 degrees of Cancer. See, it's just in a different place because we're now comparing it to a other specific chart, the chart of the nation. But you can see that it's very close to this to the USA's natal Jupiter, which is at 5 degrees of Cancer. 11 degrees of Cancer, you would consider this a conjunction. Usually when planets are within 8 degrees on either side, that's considered a conjunction. It doesn't have to be exact. But I think it's interesting that it was a Jupiter return for the United States. And also notice that Jupiter is close to the sun. We were just talking not too long ago about how the sun is connected to vitality and to health and to life itself. And that is one of the huge meanings of it. And we were talking about how an afflicted sun can be a sign of a health problem, or it can be a sign of somebody's, like, their life force on the wane. And so we see that this is the country's ruler right here, and Venus is here too. Both of the benefics are close to the sun, which is the life force of the nation. And that suggests that whatever happens here really affects the life of the nation. You hurt this Jupiter, it's like killing the sun's best friend. And so it makes me think of our moment of vulnerability that September 11th represented. And it also makes me think of essentially our wealth, and how personally it was felt. Those attacks were felt across the country at that time. It felt like, it didn't matter whether you're living in LA or New York. This was someone attacking the heart of our country, the heart of our wealth. The sun has to do with the heart. And this is the point right here. So that's just an interesting transit that was happening at that time. But I think the big real thing to notice is our old buddy Pluto here. So here's the nation's first house, and here's the ascendant at 12 degrees of Sagittarius. And what is transiting exactly on the ascendant at that point is Pluto. And so we're looking, when we see Pluto, we think intensification and we think transformation. It's like a distilling energy. When Pluto is crossing an ascendant, when you see ascendant, think face, think identity, think viewpoint. And when you see Pluto, think transformation, intensification. And I think that's this transit right here, Pluto conjoining the US ascendant. This is really when you could say the face of our nation was about to change. And New York City itself and those towers were part of the face of our nation, so to speak. And so this was a time, if you were following the US's transits at this time, this is a time where you would expect some kind of transformation of our viewpoint, like how we saw the world transform that day and how the world saw us transform that day. And so that's a very clear, accurate manifestation of what was going on in the sky. Does anybody have any thoughts about that or questions? Okay.
Yeah,
Another,
I know that we've looked
okay.
at I know we looked at other ones, and have we seen this like with Pluto before? Like in that house, like it seems to be like Pluto is like a little destructive.
Yeah, yeah, it really can be, especially when it's exactly on something, you know. Uh,
Hmm.
and you could see Pluto as being in a way more malefic than Saturn, even though Saturn's called the greater malefic. But Pluto is it has to you can feel Pluto coming, don't get me wrong. Um, but it really has to be activated by something else in the chart in order to have a big outer world effect. Whereas because it's not Saturn is a planet we can see with the naked eye. We can't see Pluto. We only just got clear pictures of it, I think, within the last 5 or 10 years. And so Pluto has to be really exact with something, really having an exact lining up with something to have such a profound effect. But when it does, it really does. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Whereas Saturn is somebody you can feel coming from a long way away too, but it's involved with us. Saturn's trying to teach us something and help us evolve. Whereas Pluto's more like the guy next door. He, you know, what the guy does next door can have an effect on you, but things have to be lined up just right. In astrology, what you can see is always the most important. And you can't see Pluto, but you can see Saturn. Another thing, I didn't even notice this earlier, is Saturn and Uranus are also conjoining. So this is the US's seventh house. And so this is seventh house is one-on-one relationships. And Uranus is the unexpected, breaking barriers and the unexpected. So Saturn coming through and conjoining loosely Uranus. This Uranus here in the US's seventh house, I would, where is the seventh house relevant on a country scale? I would say that has something to do with our allies, like our friends. And Saturn coming along here, we're already, what this chart says, what the US chart says, is we're already unpredictable when it comes to our allies. There's a built-in unpredictability that was kind of set off by this Saturn transit. And so when you see Uranus, you 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 think of the unexpected. So that's another part of the chart that I think is significant. You could also say that this Uranus, and if you're looking at the birth chart of the United States just on its own, they would have drawn this. It's at 8 degrees of Gemini. And so it's really opposing this Pluto mess over here too. And so Saturn affects this Uranus, and it's like a pinball machine because this Uranus is across from the ascendant. The ascendant is affected unexpectedly. And that's built into the United States because Uranus is always here for the United States. The ascendant's always here for the United States. But with Pluto and Saturn both in the picture and opposing each other, affecting this area, it's like that whole part of the pinball machine lights up. So not only was our viewpoint and our identity changed by this, also what this is telling us is that our relationships with our allies, our relationships with other countries are also transformed or somehow restricted. So those are just interesting things to notice in the transit chart. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts? Okay. Just looking at conjunctions, hold on one moment. Just looking at conjunctions, there's another one right here. And here's the south node of the United States. So when we see the south node, the way to remember this is the north node looks like a rainbow, and rainbows are good. South node looks like an upside down rainbow. An upside down rainbow is bad. So that's how you can tell the north node from the south node. We notice that Neptune is also conjoining the south node. And we know that whenever the nodes are involved, there's a meant to be energy. And so having Neptune right on top, this is an exact conjunction. These outer planets in exact conjunctions you really want to watch for. And so Neptune is right on top of the south node. So this is saying something along the lines of the US's old karma has to do with third houses, communication, language, speaking, siblings, neighbors. We've got a lot of old karma around that. And even Pluto, our original Pluto, is in the neighborhood. So this Neptune is altered consciousness. And so this is a time where we wouldn't have understood our old karma, essentially. And so this is a time that would naturally be confusing for the whole country because of this particular aspect. And I remember people at the time trying to understand, saying, why us? Why did this happen? And people heard, that the hijackers were of a different faith. And so or different from, many people in the US. And so copies of the Quran sold out because people were trying to understand. But this was not a time when people could understand. The people attacking us really understood our old karma because you could say they had been affected by it. And, they were upset about things that, granted I was 20 years younger then, but I didn't understand. I didn't know why we'd been attacked. And we never at the time really figured it out. And we couldn't, probably, because of this Neptune. And so, but I think the most important thing about this 9/11 transit chart is this Pluto conjoining the ascendant. And that's because the ascendant, if you had to just do a chart with one point on it, like a minimalist chart, you'd want the ascendant to be there. That's what you'd pick. It's the most important point in the chart because that's the viewpoint. That's the face, that's the eyes of the person and the event. And to have a planet like Pluto conjoining the ascendant, that's transformation of your face, how others see you, and how you see others. And that certainly happened that day. So I thought you guys would be interested in this. Let me think about what else I wanted to say. Does anybody have any questions? Another thing to notice in the country's second house, transiting the country's second house, here it is Mars, and it conjoins the South Node. We talked earlier about how this was really the people that did this were trying to attack our wealth. They were trying to attack buildings that were associated with banking. And so Mars in the second house really, really fits that. If you're looking for a house that means finances, it's the second house of possessions. And Mars coming through separates things, separated from your possessions. And then Mars is the lesser malefic, but it's particularly powerful in this chart because it's in Capricorn and Mars is exalted in Capricorn. And it's made nastier by the old karma of the South Node. The real-time South Node, the US's South Node is over here. And that comes up again of that theme of old karma. And we talked a lot at that time about how, many people from the Middle East, from that part of the world, they're still thinking about the Crusades. They have a longer time span awareness than Americans tend to. And so I think this could be kind of a reference to that, a reference to where we have old karma kind of being split apart. And I think the attacks did affect our economy too. And that's what this is suggesting. But if you were just looking at this chart casually, it's all about that Pluto conjoins the ascendant. The more you look, the more you find, because here's the US's moon. And the moon is, after the ruler and the sun in a day chart, the moon is the third most important thing in the sky. So you could erase a lot of this other stuff because the moon is so important. I'm going to erase these lines. So looking at the US's moon, in mundane astrology, the moon always represents the people. And that's because, well, for one thing, the moon changes constantly. It moves quickly. And the mood of the moon changes quickly. The moon is about feelings, emerging feelings, and they change constantly, just like the will of any people changes constantly. So we've got the moon at 27 degrees of Aquarius here. And here's Uranus coming in at 21 degrees of Aquarius. So this is not an exact conjunction, but it's a fairly close conjunction. And so this is the people of the US, and Uranus is something unexpected. So this is akin to something unexpected happening to the people. So the longer you look, the more you can find things that fit this. And it can be very interesting to look at events that happened in the past, because you can really you can see how, like for September 11th, I think there was a lot of things going on in the sky that all added up to an event like that, which is, that was probably like a once in a lifetime event. And when it happened, I remember, going home and watching the news and just thinking like, I guess this is the kind of thing that happens in the world, but it really doesn't, fortunately, most of the time for us in the US, but it did change us that day. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? I've got one
Do
more.
COVID next.
Oh yes, definitely. The COVID charts are fascinating. The
Yeah, that would be cool to see. Just thinking
well,
about stuff in our lifetime that has changed the US.
yeah, yeah, that would be fascinating to look at the US's chart at the time of COVID. And that brings up a good question. When did COVID start?
Yeah.
Do you remember all those people were dying from vaping, maybe in the month before COVID became a thing. And people were saying, oh, it's the only thing we can figure out with all these people with weird lung problems is they were all vaping. And that, I think they took some of the ingredients out of the vapes at that time, like vitamin E or something like that. So it may have been that, but that may have been COVID in the country. So,
Yeah.
but when would we, when would you pick as a day for COVID?
I would I would think the day that we officially shut down, like where they declared it like a shutdown, because that's kind of where it officially got its
Yeah, like this is a problem.
world shut. I mean, we shut down. The US shut down that day where Trump kept everybody at home. So I don't know. That's my opinion. I don't know how else you would.
Yeah. My thought is maybe the day they named it.
Oh yeah.
That
Yeah.
that might be that might be it. But yeah, what you're mentioning is more like a moment where a plane hits a tower. That's the moment where it really started to impact us. And so I think that's a good moment
Do
too.
both, Hannah,
Oh, we could definitely do both.
and
And
see how they correlate.
the charts would tell us what's relevant.
Yeah.
So we know looking at the at charts for events that we look at transits and progressions. And so we'll just have a quick look at the progressions for the US that day. It can be interesting to look at the chart of the US as us as a collective. And that's something that I think the country is so divided right now. We don't see ourselves as a collective in the same way that we did at this particular time. And I don't know how that would even manifest astrologically. It's just something a lot of people have noticed and talked about. So here's the US's progress chart. Does anybody have any thoughts? Now remember the transits are a snapshot of where the planets were in the sky that day. The progressions are uh, the birth chart of the US moved forward one day for each year. So say the US at that time was 225 years old, roughly. My math is not good. It was about that old. And so this is 225 days after July 4th, 1776. This is what the chart looked like. But it also is sort of like a holographic zoom in to the events of that day as well. Um, but when you're looking at progressions versus transits, you really want to look at those outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars. With progressions, the ones to really notice are the moon and the sun because they move the fastest, and sometimes Venus and Mercury. Do you guys notice anything significant about this chart? I would say looking at the sun and the moon, we have the US has Uranus here in the seventh house at the eighth degree of Gemini, and the progressed moon had moved to 0 degrees of Gemini. So it's giving about 8 or 10 degrees, counting as a conjunction. We have the moon conjoining. I mean, the progressed Uranus is never going to be far from the original Uranus, but the moon here is activating all that Uranus. And so this is, I think this is really speaking to how our allies saw us or how people elsewhere in the world saw us. They may have seen something unexpected happening to us. And this is the midheaven of the United States, the original midheaven of the United States. And so the moon activating Uranus, which trines the midheaven. And trines are actually good if you're dividing things into good, bad, which you kind of have to in order to make sensible astrology. But this was a time when we were seen very positively by the whole world. I think we had most of the world's sympathy on that particular day because our friends, as represented over here by the seventh house, saw this as something unexpected happening. And that we had some credibility with them, you know, that, has a lot's changed in the last however long it's been, 23 years. But this talks a little bit about how our position in the world or our reputation in the world, because it's midheaven, really, really got a positive boost from this, at least for a while. So I think that's something that's interesting to notice. Another thing that's interesting to notice is our progressed sun was right on top of the original moon of the US. And you could read that. Now remember that the moon represents the people in mundane astrology, among other things. But that's the first place to go, is that it represents the people. And so the sun represents joy, vitality, just like we were talking about, will to live. And so if we didn't know this was the chart for September 11th, having the progressed sun conjoining the natal moon, I would say this is a good thing. This is a good time for the people because the sun is shining on them, essentially. This moon being the people and the sun doing the shining. Now, the moon and the sun in Aquarius, they're both kind of weak in Aquarius. The sun rules Leo, which is over here. And so we know it's not that happy in Aquarius, and neither is the moon. But this is still a relatively positive time. And it probably felt like a positive time. And so that's just one thing that's interesting to notice. Another thing is progressed Black Moon Lilith and Mars. The progressed Mars and progressed Black Moon Lilith were both conjoining our Saturn. This Saturn is it's in the 11th house for the United States. So this would say Saturn is your greatest challenge, right? Because it's the greater benefic. Saturn in the 11th house, if this were a person's chart, if you see Saturn in the 11th house, it's like they have trouble fitting in, they have trouble making friends, which is also suggested over here with Uranus and our allies. This 7th house for us might be like Great Britain or other countries that we think are our close buddies. Whereas this is more of our standing in the world, our hopes and dreams, and Saturn is there. And this is an exalted Saturn because it's in Libra. But the negative effects of Saturn would be coming out with Mars and Black Moon Lilith there. And so we're already having difficulty playing well with others because of this Saturn. And that's really activated by the wild energies of Black Moon Lilith. When you see Black Moon Lilith, think wild. And when you see Mars, think separation. And so if we had been looking at this chart on that day, like what does the progressed chart of the US look like? You could see that while we have some favorability that's brought on by this moon being in the 7th house, trining the midheaven, it's like people think well of us. But at the same time, we have trouble in this area that's really activated by this. And 11th house is also hopes and dreams. It can be like plans, what's wanted. I think there's a lot in these charts, especially with what Mars is doing, both in the transit chart and the progress chart, that really suggest war. And I remember a friend of mine, like on that day, was walking around saying, "We're going to war. We're invading Iraq. We're going to war." And I was, "What are you talking about? This doesn't have anything. One doesn't have anything to do with the other." But she was right. And I think this involvement of Mars, Black Moon Lilith, I mean, Mars is the traditional god of war. So, another thing to notice is in the US natal chart, this Pluto and the South Node they're barely conjoining. And in the progress chart, the South Node has moved and it's conjoining Pluto. And this is all in the second house of the United States. So there's an intense energy around the wealth of the United States because we were just born that way. We have Pluto in the second house. And what does that mean for the United States? That could be a whole other class, but it means that where anywhere Pluto is where you're intense and where there's trauma. And we are intense about wealth in the United States, and we are intense and there's a trauma connected to wealth in the United States going back to the beginning where people fought over this land, and then the South Node is old karma. And so a tight conjunction like this equals things manifesting. But anyway, we're out of time. But thank you guys so much. And next time we'll look at COVID. And if anybody thinks of anything positive we can look at, let me know. But positive events aren't always as interesting. Everybody have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.